As the offseason rolls on for the Brooklyn Nets, the pressing question still remains: does Cam Thomas have a role for this team? We take a look at his skill set, the minutes breakdown for Brooklyn, and ultimately, what do we think is the outcome for Cam heading into the upcoming season? We dive in next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, my friends, it is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. Over there, you're going to find Doug Norrie. He's the owner-operator of DFSR. For all your daily fantasy sports rankings from DraftKings to FanDuel, he's got you covered. I'm Adam Arbrecht, breaking down the New York Football Giants on the One Giant podcast. My boy, Andy Mack. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day. We're free on all those great platforms. And Doug, this feels like the age-old question in spite of the player not having been in the league that long. Cam Thomas, we're going to talk about this first and foremost, what we think is going to happen. We'll give our outcomes here to start and then re-illustrate what his skill set is, the moves that the Nets have made this offseason, and why it kind of formulates, at least in theory, where headed for Cam in his future with the Brooklyn Nets.
It's really one of the most confusing situations that has sort of baffled Nets fans over the last couple of years, us included, about sort of like, and really the question is like, what is the organizational plan with Cam Thomas and how do they view Cam Thomas? It's incredibly hard to figure out. And as we, head into the offseason here and then ultimately head into the season, it's going to be a major question about like sort of where we think he ends up landing on the team, short-term, long-term, development-wise. Is he a part of the Nets' future? And we'll get into that first and then break down the rest of it later and how we kind of got here. But it is really one of those situations that I'll just put it as a head-scratcher, sort of like from all angles.
And it's funny, too, because we're going to get to this question here. But remember, when he gets taken in the first round of the NBA draft along with Day'Ron Sharpe, even at that time, when we talked about what is Cam Thomas, he's a microwave scorer. He can get a bucket for you. And that's been proven over his NBA career so far. But you and I both looked at it at the time and said, how does this fit what you're doing right now with Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving and a championship-ready team where you want veterans? That fades away, and the Brooklyn Nets don't seemingly reevaluate and reutilize what Cam Thomas is going to be for them. So that being the case, before we get into all the details of it, what is the outcome for Cam Thomas? I'll go first. We're on the same track here with this, but the path to it may look different. I believe that Cam Thomas gets traded in season by the NBA deadline. Now, there's a laundry list of reasons why, but that just seems like, based on what the organization has done or not done with him, the moves they've made this offseason, and by the way, remember, they also have to make a decision about picking up the option with him as well. There's a lot of things here that they have to figure out. I think by the time we get through the deadline, Cam Thomas is somewhere else and likely in a much larger role for a bad team.
Yeah, you kind of didn't bury it, but you kind of said it before, is that we came into this in mini lockstep. We talked about this quickly off the air about where we thought this was going to land. I'm with you that I don't think he's part of the Nets' future. Now, I want to be clear. This is not us saying what we think should happen.
Correct.
This is, and which we'll get to as we go along here, but this is us saying what, based on the evidence that's been given to us by the team, either through, sort of actionable evidence or lack of action evidence based on how you sort of look at it, information that's in the void. I think that this is where it really feels like it's pointing. I hope that this is not the case, but it's really hard to make the case. Frankly, it's hard to make the case going the other way, about that he's a big part of the organizational plan, just based on all the things that we've seen so far. So I agree with you. I think that when it's all said and done, the future for him does not lie in Brooklyn. And I would love to be proven wrong about that, because a team that's focused maybe more on development this season maybe takes a different tact. But I mean, let's get into some of the reasons why, like what we've seen before, because I think that this is definitely rooted in reality.
Yeah, and I think one of the fascinating elements to me is when we talk about thinking that he'll be traded by the deadline. Um, Part of that for me is going to be that he continues to showcase what his best attribute is, like being an offensive weapon, right? Being a guy that can go get you points. And I anticipate that frustrating Nets fans even further, right? Because it's not going to be, in my mind, that Cam Thomas continues to peter out, or he goes out there and all of a sudden the percentages just go into the dumpster and he looks like a total disaster. While there are holes in his game, the consistency, and we talked about this last season, he slowly has shown these incremental pieces of growth. The perimeter shooting, first and foremost, that we weren't so sure about when he came into the league. He showed the improvement there. I can make a strong case that Cam Thomas actually continues to show growth and still cannot find a way to crack this rotation for the Brooklyn Nets, right? And that has a lot to do with the players that they brought in here this offseason with Dennis Smith Jr., who the Nets said they made a priority. And then Dennis Smith Jr. confirmed that he was made a priority, and he turned down more money to return to Charlotte specifically because of the role that he thought he was going to be able to step into with Brooklyn. That's a problem. Lonnie Walker, that's a problem. Armani Brooks got his two-way contract. I don't know if that's a problem in front of Cam, but it's a problem right behind Cam because it's another guy that could be eating away some of your minutes at some point. That to me is the first indicator here, right? There's so many guys around Cam Thomas that the Nets actively chose to give opportunities to this offseason.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, so that's like the one signal that they really sent with who they brought in already on the contracts. They brought in these kind of combo / point guard guys. I mean, Walker's more like a shooting guard, but they brought in two guards as sort of like their other young guys that they want to bring in. Like you mentioned, that there's probably been some, mini assurances around playing time, at least to start. And when you couple that with how we saw the season end. Yep. Last season, because you have to look back at this, right? Like there was last season. It's really funny. Last season was the tale of two totally different seasons for the Brooklyn Nets, except for Cam Thomas. It was the same the whole time. Right? The team that was a KD Kyrie centric team that like sort of had championship aspirations. He didn't really get to play that much. Then the team totally shifts into this new group, and you're trying to figure out what they're going to be. And he also still doesn't get to play that much, except that the times he does play, you can't stop him from scoring 40 points, right? So it's like, it's just the weirdest situation. But if you look at the end of the season stuff that happened with him down the home stretch, and outside of the last game of the season, which was just a throwaway game, he dropped 46, by the way. The outside of that, there's the minutes. It was just kind of like no minutes, and DNP is all over the place. Yep. And that's just not a guy that the organization has any trust in on a team level. He got to play when there was no one. He only got to play real minutes when no one else could play. That's the thing. Yep. And it didn't matter who was there early, and it didn't matter who was there late. And they just brought in dudes that kind of play the same position as him. And so I just don't know what you do. Like, I don't know how, I actually don't know how you predict it any other way, except that you just want it to happen. Because the evidence is simply not there.
So coming up here in a second, we'll take a look at what is Cam Thomas's skill set. Why have the Brooklyn Nets seemingly been disinterested in trying to further develop him, even underneath this new developmental coaching staff? We'll also, of course, mention that trade speculation around Miami, Tyler Hero, and why that could further muddy the waters of Cam Thomas in Brooklyn.
All right, before we get to that, going to tell you about our friends over at FanDuel. Take your first swing at betting MLB on FanDuel. You're going to get 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets. That's up to $200. You heard me right here. All you got to do, you bet $20, and you'll land $200 in bonus bets, whether you win or lose on FanDuel. You can't beat that. It's $200 that you can spend on everything from the money line to the over-under. Who you think is going to hit the first home run? Maybe you want to get on some of those strikeout props. Maybe you want to switch over to NBA for a little bit and get in on the Mikal Bridges most improved player. He's currently the favorite over on FanDuel Sportsbook, all on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Plus, when you win, you get paid instantly. There's no better place to bet on MLB than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Sign up today and visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get up to $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official partner of Major League Baseball.
All right. So when we talk about Cam Thomas and the skill set, I think there's two things to look at here. One of which is just going to be the minutes breakdown, which is the other fascinating angle that we'll talk about with the players that they brought in. Cam Thomas, for whatever he is not, has shown you, as you mentioned, down the stretch of last season. It's funny. Patty Mills, not playing, not on the team anymore. Yuta Watanabe, not playing, not on the team anymore. Joe Harris, we can actually make this as confounding as anything because he was on the team and was playing when everybody knew he wasn't going to be here anymore. Seth Curry, another guy. There is a group of players that either were playing and had no business playing, a la the veterans in Curry and in Harris, or weren't playing and maybe should have been because maybe they could have been a part of this in Yuta Watanabe. Cam Thomas still couldn't find that path forward. Like you do a better job kind of sometimes deep diving on numbers. What inside of his numbers would explain why the Brooklyn Nets don't play him? Like beyond the points, right? He's putting up points, but or do they? Is there anything in the numbers that suggests, oh, this is why they don't play him?
Okay, yeah. So the easy numbers for him, it's like there's like probably three pretty easy numbers that would point to why they don't play him. I can also point to plenty of evidence for like why they should. But I'll give you the three. I'll give you the two major ones, right? The first one, major one, is he's 6'3". And why does that matter? Okay, it matters with the next number, which is he averages over his time, like over like 17 minutes a game, his assist rate was like 1.4. He had a 1.4 to 1.1 assist to turnover rate. I'm putting those two together because when you're his size, you have to be something more of an offensive facilitator than just a scorer, right? You have to, and because essentially I think that those numbers actually contribute the most to why, and then the eye test will go with it here as to why the team does not like to run him major minutes. He's really small, so he's already a defensive liability, which means you need to often pair him with like a much better defensive guard. All right. Or else the backcourt is going to have really, really difficult time, sort of point of attack defense. You know, maybe Ben Simmons helps solve that. Like maybe that unlocks him a little bit. I don't know. But so that's problem number one. Then problem number two is when he's on the court, he is amazing at scoring. The problem is he doesn't do anything else on offense, right? Like, and so he's like not a threat to do anything else. You kind of either know he's putting it up or you know he's kind of like turning it over. Like it's just, or he's just probably just missing shots, right? So those are the bad numbers. There's plenty of good numbers, so don't get me wrong. I just think that I think the Nets see him. My strong suspicion is the Nets see him. I'm putting the words here, so this is not like quoted as like an empty calories player. Right? It's like you can score a ton. And Jacques Vaughn's kind of said it. Like he said this before about him. He's like, yeah, well, you know, he scores 40 points, but we lose all those games. Right? Like I'm paraphrasing, but he said something to that effect. It's like, yeah, we still lost all those games where he scored 40 or whatever. So I think that it's like this combination of can't get enough done on defense, isn't dynamic enough on like an all-around offensive game, and that like his fame or you know his what people see him as is as the scorer, but like from a team point of view that's like not just, it's just not holistic enough, it's not good enough, right? Like is that the case? Is that a good enough case to make about why I'm this is speculation, we don't know exactly, but this is putting a lot of different pieces together about why I think those minutes aren't there for him.
And the reason why I think it's a good outside looking in perspective would also be because a lot of people, fans, a lot of times when we bring up Cam Thomas, they'll say, point guard. They'll refer to him as point guard. And you'd still be looking at a small point guard. He's not a point guard.
No, he's not
and that, to your point, is like you're a scorer. You need to be off ball. At the two guard spot, you are undersized. You're not good defensively. And if you can't function without the ball in your hands, you're going to run into problems. Yeah, go ahead.
One clarification. He can be on ball. He's just never going to pass.
Right. You cannot be on ball as the total team offensive game that we need you to be. And that's the big split that we said about why, when you say, oh, is he a point guard? No, he's not. Not that you couldn't play him at point guard. You could. And like to your point, no one else would ever see the basketball. That's why he can't be a point guard. So then at that point, he's undersized at the two. You don't have a lot else other than, I think it's a really good way to phrase it, empty calorie kind of points for him. And now as we swing it kind of the other way, just to balance this out, a lot of people would make the case of, yeah, well, why aren't they winning those games? Because he's scoring 40 points when you're not playing with anybody else. It's not like you put him in for prime minute shares with the best other players on the roster to see how he could play. And you could make the case, and we're going to talk about minutes here on the back end, which is a big hurdle for him. But you could also make the case that coming out of the Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving era, that was a really hard spot for him to find a role and to function in, because we got the bucket getters. We got the on-ball scorers. So now the things that you don't do so well are really a glaring issue for you to get on the court. So you can't play with the superstar roster. And now as you go into the developmental mode, maybe unfortunately because the Nets haven't had the pure point guard, you don't feel secure enough, and the Nets aren't a particularly big team, in running Cam Thomas out there for real minutes, because frankly, the sum of the parts, it's just, he's always going to probably be a bit of a breakdown point for the offensive system that you want to run.
Right. And so here's the flip side of this, right? The flip side of this is there are numbers that suggest that the coaching staff has done a really, really bad job of utilizing him, right? So you can easily, this is the other side of it, and I see this side totally, is that how can it be that a guy that can be this good at some of these things can't play? Like that would feel like a failing of the coaching staff at that point, because it simply doesn't compute. It doesn't compute that you would have a guy that can do these things so well, and yet the staff cannot find ways to sort of like prop up the things he does well and get him to do some of the other things that he doesn't do better, or have it fit more into a mold. Like that should probably be on coaching, because if you look at some of these other numbers, like last year, the minutes went down, but like the 3-point attempts basically stay the same. He got up to over 38% from three. And by the way, his 3-pointers aren't like standing in the corner threes. I mean, a lot of these were like heavily contested, off the dribble, sidestep. Like he takes tough shots. So
which the Nets need, right? Which the Nets need some. Yeah,
totally. For him to shoot 38% is like not the same as some of these other guys that are just getting wide open looks. Now, also his catch and shoot stuff was really, really good over the course of the year. He's the third best catch and shoot guy on the team with an effective field goal rate on catch and shoot of 63%. It was behind only Yuta and Joe Harris. And again, those shots are way tougher. Now catch and shoot's a little different because he's like just catching and shooting. But overall, his shot selection is much tougher than some of these other guys because he's on the ball so much. It feels insane that the coaching staff would not be able to utilize this in some way, this like sort of elite skill.
Yeah.
I know at the start, I said, these are the downsides. Those downsides aren't, I was sort of putting myself in the place of the coaching staff. Those downsides to me are not good enough to not.
They do not outweigh. They do not outweigh.
You have not found a way to unlock this guy. Like it doesn't. I don't know. Go ahead.
No, and by the way, because we're gonna get to minutes here in a minute. But remember, last year we talked about this with Cam Thomas and saying, listen, the things, the shortcomings he has, okay, they exist. So at the end of quarters, at the start of quarter, end of first quarter, end of the second quarter, give him 3 minutes to run. Where in the second unit, when you're going to pull out whatever it is, whenever you're taking your starters out here, whether it's buying some rest at the start of a quarter or the start of a second half, whenever you're taking Mikal Bridges, Cam Johnson, Spencer Dinwiddie, right? When those guys come off, tell him. Now I know, to your point, you need to develop his all-around game better. You need to instill defensive, just proper, technique so you can be a speed bump. You need to want him to be a better facilitator. But until he is that thing, let him go out there and cook for a burst. There's no world where you can't walk away from 10 minutes of Cam Thomas and say, guess what? He plays 10 minutes a night, and sometimes he gives us 18 points. And for a team that needs offensive firepower, it's really hard to not see that path going forward. Coming up here in a second, we'll lay out the minute breakdown, which Doug has done before this offseason, and I crunched those numbers just to double check, and why there's a real logjam ahead of Cam Thomas here in finding a path if he stays on this roster going forward. Okay, so the reality here when we're talking about Cam Thomas, and Doug and I both said at the top of the show, we think that he will ultimately be traded by the deadline in season. We also made it very clear that is not what we would do. This is what we think will happen. And at least a part of the logic there is looking at what the Nets did this offseason, looking at the minutes breakdown, and saying, where does Cam Thomas have minutes, right? You had your specific numbers, but I think we're better specifically around like Dorian Finney-Smith coming into this season. But the area that we agreed on, just as a starting point, it's about 165 minutes locked into the starting rotation, around about there. And then you would get into some of those other guys, but you can illustrate them as you see fit.
Yeah. Okay. So real quick, I'm going to read you another list here real fast of
Okay.
players, and it's going to lead into the minutes conversation because you're going to see, you're going to be scratching your head. I'm going to give you a list of seemingly random players here and their roles on their current teams, and then where Cam Thomas fits in with this. Ready? Here, I'm going to do it fast. Keegan Murray, real playoff minutes for Sacramento, really good player. Davion Mitchell, real minutes, played all through the playoffs. Brandon Clark, I mean, critical piece for Memphis. Josh Hart, I mean, absolutely critical piece for the Knicks now. Lonzo Ball was a critical piece. His legs fell off, but not his fault. Was really, really good. Tyus Jones, obviously we talked about him a ton, what his importance is. Kyle Anderson, critical piece for Minnesota. Jonas Valanciunas, we know about him. Damian Lillard, that's the last 10 years. And then Glenn Rice, I'm going to leave him off. You know what that list is?
Guards that score over some amount of points per per minute, like on a per minute basis.
Summer League MVPs. That's the list. That's the list of Summer League MVPs over the last decade. That list is chock full of either superstars, and by the way, and Cam Thomas, of the guys who've won that. And I left his name off the list, but he's the other guy that's not there. That list is all superstars or like butting up against not superstars, but like real deal NBA rotation players. Yeah. And then there's Glenn Rice for some reason, just out of nowhere. And then Cam Thomas, and then Cam Whitmore this year. And my God, he looks like he's going to be really good. So now, as we go into the minutes, think about this, about what those other guys' roles are on their current teams, and then where we are land with Cam Thomas. Because here's the other thing. There's a real crunch around Nets minutes also. You said, what'd you say, 165?
I said 165 for the starting unit. It averages out to be about 32, 33 minutes right across the five.
Right. I have it 157. So let's just split the difference. We say the starters play about 160 minutes, and that's being real conservative over DFS's minutes, right? Then you get 20 to 25 for Ben Simmons. That feels right. Okay. Right. Like I'm just going to give it like a little range. 22 to 25 for Royce O'Neal. Okay. Lonnie Walker and DSJ, we just said that they were sort of promised minutes. We'll go low with them and say 10 each. All of a sudden, you're at 225 minutes for the whole team. Nothing we said. That's 15 total minutes left 50 per game. 15 total minutes left per game for Cam Thomas, Daron Sharp, Noah Clowney, probably not going to play, Darius Baisley, Jalen Wilson. Like, I guess they go to Cam, right? But like, do you feel amazing saying it? I don't, because I could go a little higher on each of those guys I just mentioned too.
Yeah, 100%. Because when I looked at him too, it was like you mentioned Ben Simmons. Like I did it now. Daron Sharp is a real curious one, right? But then they get Baisley, and he's signed to a 1-year contract. So even if it's him and Daron Sharp for 10 total minutes, when you get down to that crunch there, the big problem, at least from a Cam Thomas standpoint, is the guys that you mentioned that are ahead of him, right? Spencer Dinwiddie, Walker, Smith Jr., Ben Simmons is going to be, we talked about this last episode when we were discussing, or earlier in the week when we were discussing Baisley and what his role was going to look like, right? It's like, well, Ben Simmons, the better and healthier that he is the more that he eats everybody's minutes, because that's how good and how versatile he can be. So yeah, like in theory, with what this team needs, scoring, Cam Thomas is exactly who you'd put in there. But how do you put him in for that minute share when you know, or at least we think in theory, your backcourt already occupies what, 35, 40 minutes a game, is spread out there, 50 minutes a game. What does it end up being? It's like, how can you dedicate 70 minutes to, your backcourt among 5 or 6 players? Like, it's just never going to happen that way. So that's where it just feels unrealistic in this moment to think that Cam Thomas has a role here. And I even, by the way, mentioned, like, it sounds silly to say this. It is silly to say it. The fact that the Nets gave Armani Brooks a 2-way contract is still symbolic of a guy that can get called up to the NBA level, plays in the backcourt, and in theory is good at knocking down perimeter shots, right? So it's like you're slowly seeing them have guys in place that can do some of the things that Cam Thomas does. I'll even go a step further with Dennis Smith Jr., by the way, for whatever we think Cam Thomas is or is not, on ball, off ball. Dennis Smith Jr. is going to attack downhill and get at the basket on the offensive end. He's known defensively, and he's going to be a facilitator. But some of those things that we think Cam Thomas does that the Nets really lacked, guess what? There's some players on this roster now that can do those things in compartmentalized instances.
Yeah, and I agree with you totally. And we talk about like sort of the roster makeup and where it goes. I will, if you look at, and one other thing to like just sort of take note of. So if you look at Cam Thomas's minutes from last year, you're going to see, he averaged 16.6 minutes a game. And that, again, that's only over 57 games, right? He was available for all 82. So the number actually dips down. If you go to like actual available games, it's more, they don't do it this way because it would just be weird with the numbers, like games you were available. So just throw things off. But it's more like 11 minutes a game, like for over the course of a season is around what he played. I had him right at like 10, I think is where I landed, with the understanding that they're going to probably come in chunks. Like it's not going to be a 10 steady.
Right.
Like
20 minutes on a
rotation.
Tuesday night, no minutes the next 4 nights.
Right. Exactly. Right. Something like that. Right. And that, right. Well, that would be 5 minutes, but yeah, 5 minutes per game. But the but you know what I'm saying?
Geez, never give Doug a for instance. It's never going to get you anywhere, buddy. He's going to do the quick math, and he's going to hold you to it.
But so my point is like, just tell everyone out there, tell yourself the same story. Like walk yourself through the stories, because this is what we're trying to walk ourselves through. Is like you have to tell yourself a story. None of this is about what we want to happen, and as my Twitter replies would suggest, people have very high expectations of Cam Thomas. I mean, like some of these things that I asked people to predict, what was like, give me some out of the box takes here. And some of these things were completely wild. I can't even read them. Be like,
there's some extreme ones in there.
But so my point is like, but it highlights the fandoms and our sort of like hopes and confusion all at the same time. But then when you put it in these constraints around like what's actually going to happen with this roster, it just looks even more bleak. It looks like, how do you put him on just to go back to the top? How do you have him on this team with the way it's shaping up? It's like, you can't predict it that way.
There's some chance we're going to run a little bit long here, because first off, let's remind everybody that this looming idea the Nets could land Tyler Hero in the Miami Damian Lillard trade, and that's a byproduct. They get Tyler Hero. We talk about, scenarios. Cam Thomas may not even be on the roster to start the season, because then you have replaced the scoring on-ball guy in your backcourt, and you feel like you've solved that problem in a way beyond what you currently have and the age of Tyler Hero. Right? You can just say, look, we got a better player that fills that role and does other things for us, whatever, however picture you want to paint. That's fine. The other thing for me is, like, I remember saying this after the trades. I said that Cam Thomas should have played 20 minutes the rest of the season last year. Like, you should have done everything to try to get a full sample size for every reason we talk about. And I think organizationally, the problem that I have with this, and I think there is a silver lining, but the problem I have with it is the Nets seem to be preventing, overexposing how good Cam Thomas can be offensively. And ironically, he's already proved it, right? Every time they've given him a sniff, he goes out and he lights it up. So I think the Nets are like trying to protect the perception of how good this kid could be, regardless of fit and deficiencies, etc. It's just about, boy, you're going to give up a guy, Summer League MVPs. Here's the list of guys that are incredibly valuable at the NBA level, and you're going to walk away from him. My silver lining, when we go back to the top, I think the Nets should be playing him. I think the Nets should be developing him. They should be working with him. You got a first-round pick. Why would you waste that opportunity? But if they end up trading him at the deadline, I actually think it will facilitate a quality move for this team going forward, because I think other teams around the league will see the value in Cam Thomas. I don't think there's going to be a dump. Like, hey, Cam Thomas, we couldn't figure him out for whatever it may be. Worst case scenario, I can see the Nets getting themselves a first-round pick back next year where they don't have any currently. So I think that there is a silver lining to what is a bad process by Brooklyn, I'm pretty sure, with Cam Thomas. But sometimes you got to take the best of a bad situation.
Yeah, and I will say, like, one other thing, and I mentioned this at the top, and I agree with everything you said. Like, I think, like, with the Hero piece, it could be it. And I it's hard to, like, know what his trade value is right now, because he could be really highly valued in another team's eyes, like a rebuilding team. Like, they could really see a lot of value in that and be like, hey, he's already shown he can do certain things. I mentioned Ben Simmons at the top, like, as just like sort of a guy that could help unlock, as will be the theme with every single guy that we talk about. Ben Simmons helps unlock Ben Simmons, except for like maybe Claxton. because they
Right.
can't space the floor. Literally everybody else is helped by a healthy Ben Simmons being on the court. And even then the defense would be amazing. Cam Thomas is just another one of these guys where we talked about like sort of his defensive deficiencies and like needing to play off ball a little bit. Like Ben Simmons would really help that. Like he could play point of attack defense on another team's best ball handler. Like you could sustain, especially during the regular season, what Cam can't do on defense. He could play off the ball a little bit more and not have to worry about having the ball in his hands because they could run like DHO stuff with Simmons. And I'll give you a stat too. Last season, Cam was like a negative player from a plus minus, or excuse me, net rating over the course of the season. 166 minutes Cam Thomas and Ben Simmons played together last year, and I don't know who the other combinations were. So 166, small sample size. You ready for this?
Yeah.
120 offensive rating, 111 defensive rating, plus 9. Plus 9 net rating with Ben Simmons and Cam Thomas. Well, again, Simmons unlocks a lot of this stuff. We might think differently about him with this kind of guy next to him.
And go ahead, punch in if you can in the background because you're quick at this. Like put in the Kevin Durant, put in the big names with that group and have the guys that are on and off court just to see what the true sample size is with Simmons and Cam Thomas when they're on and other key people are on the court potentially. Because just to your point about we've illustrated what we think is going to happen. What should happen is that, again, remember what this team is right now. They are not a championship aspiration team. So all up until that trade deadline, if your agenda is ultimately we think we're going to move off of Cam Thomas and try to get something back, whatever the case may be, everything up to that should be incremental doses with Ben Simmons if he's going to be healthy and on the court, right? As small as the backcourt may look, with Dennis Smith Jr., where you go, put him in a spot where he can't get the ball in his hands and just, gobble up the dribble and take everybody out of their rhythm. See if you can develop him into that role that you want for him. If it doesn't work out, that's fine. If the minutes don't look good, if the plus minus, if the net rating, if all those things drive you in the direction of saying, yes, he's a talented offensive player, but he just can't get it done in a team mentality, fine. But do not sell yourself short by not trying to find him minutes and then just kind of winding down the clock. Because then when you do move off of him, make no mistake, he goes to one of those bottom teams in the league. He's going to instantly get inserted into the starting lineup. He's going to be a big point scorer. And whether or not he's a great team player, Nets fans everywhere will lose their mind when they see him putting up 40-point performances like they've had glimpses of over his young career with Brooklyn.
All right, so real quick, we'll get out here on this. Those two guys together, the list is so long. Hold on one second. I just had it. Those two guys together with Kyrie and Durant off the court last year. It's actually ends up being 118 minutes, 120 offensive rating, 115. So the defense gets worse, 115, but still a plus 4.37.
The fact that it's
rating.
Positive,
Again,
the fact that it's in the plus is all that matters there.
Exactly. Super small sample size. But again, that is one of those numbers that would pass the eye test for you if you thought about it.
Yep.
Right? It's like, hey, could these two guys coexist in an offense together and they complement each other pretty well? Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me, right? So like that number, sure, the sample size is small, but just from a casual, outsider view standpoint of like thinking of even beyond the numbers, like it makes a lot of sense that would be the case. Okay, we are going to get out of here. Fun week with basketball stuff here, obviously. Make sure you are subscribed to Locked On Nets on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to Locked On Nets wherever you listen to podcasts as well, Spotify, iTunes. It's all free for you. And you subscribing and tuning in is what helps us come to you every single day. And it's just going to be, that's what helps us, keeps us afloat, baby. So subscribe to YouTube, subscribe to the iPod, subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen.
Listen, you're my children and I love you, but you're all terrible at what you do here. And I feel like I should tell you, I'd fire you all if I could. That's Bob Belcher from Bob's Burgers.
Oh, one of the all-time great poets. We'll be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.
Basketball.